it's Penny Black and Jill Foster here for another PB&J card class. And in today's card class, I will be sharing 4 different cards, all showcasing different ways to use our Heart Charms creative die set. So here's a look at the 4 cards that we will be creating today. And they use similar layouts and designs with just some alterations of different stamps and sentiments. And really quick here before we begin, I'm just going to put up a list of the supplies that I'll be using in creating the cards today. But I will be putting this back up on screen at the very end of the video. So if you want to check it out in more detail at that time, you can just hit pause and check out everything that you would like to see. So to begin, I'm going to be working on a cardstock panel, and I have first die cut this panel using the largest in our Elegant Stitching die set, and I'm going to stamp this with the sentiment from our Words Sweet sentiment stamp set. So I have set this up in my Misty stamp positioning tool, and I've just kind of using the magnets there and laid out my die cut pieces just so I can get the sentiment right where I want it. I'm inking that with Versamark ink, and then I will sprinkle this with white embossing powder and then heat to set. And I'm just stamping this a couple of times here to make sure I have a really good impression and I've got all the detail of that stamped image. And then here we go with the embossing powder, and then off camera I will heat that and set that. So I used a piece of colored cardstock here, but I'm also going to add some inks on top of this. And by starting with a piece of colored cardstock, it's sort of my lightest color in the blend, it just makes it a lot easier to blend the colors on top. You don't have to add quite as many layers, and you can get a really nice smooth blend. I'm using Wendy Vecchi Make Art blendable dye inks. I've chosen these for a couple of reasons. One, I wanted to use the dye ink so that I could ink right over the top of that emboss sentiment, and that will resist those inks, and if there's any excess ink that stays on the embossing, I can just wipe it off with a paper towel. I also chose these inks because I just really love these colors, and I'm applying the ink using an ink blending tool and a foam pad. I started with my lightest color down at the bottom, and then I am working up to the darkest colors up at the top. And this kind of creates a really nice blend of reds to yellows. And I thought for something just a little non-traditional, it would be fun to use this touch of yellow in this card. So I'm keeping with the red hearts, but it's kind of having this sunshiny, happy background. And with the Sentiment Happy Heart Day, I love that you could send this to a friend. You could give this to a little child, perhaps a granddaughter or a niece or a nephew even, that you could give this card to for Valentine's Day. So I die cut using our Heart Charms die, and I just cut a bunch of different sizes of these from red cardstock, and this is the die I'll be featuring on all 4 of the cards today. And to give these just a touch of added dimension, I'm just taking my red geranium Make Art blendable die inks, and I'm just adding that up near the top of the die. And you can see then when I add that onto the cardstock, you can really see those heart charms. Now what I did is I used some foam squares behind those, and then I'm just sort of threading my twine through the charms. So I adhered, especially the larger ones, down first. Then I can add the twine and just sort of pull them up in the arrangement that I want. The little ones don't stick quite as well, and also because there's ink on that background, it doesn't stick quite as well till that ink totally dries. While you're manipulating the twine. Once the twine is on and you're not pushing on it, they stay perfectly fine. So I'm going to just wrap that around behind and just use some regular old Scotch tape to tape that in the back. And then I'll do that for the other row of hearts that goes down the card. And then all I'm doing here is just gluing on some pre-tied bows. I use that same twine. Just tied 3 bows, and I am attaching that right on 3 of those hearts. And I added this panel to a white note card, and I used lots of dimensional adhesive behind that. I just used some foam tape because I had actually sort of folded that when I was applying the ink, so that sort of evened out that crease and made it look nice and even. So that is such an easy and really fun card that you can make. And I made another color variation, so following the exact same techniques and layout and products. I did that starting with a piece of pink cardstock as my background and inking that with some darker pink inks. Now I'm going to use our Fairy Love stamp and combine it with the heart charms. So I am going to begin by stamping this adorable little girl. I'm stamping her extending off the bottom of the card. So this is just a fun, different way to use this stamp. I'm stamping this onto heavyweight 110-pound smooth white cardstock. You could also use Nina Solar white cardstock, any kind of paper that you like to use for coloring with Copic markers. I'll be using the Copic markers on this. And I'm using Memento Tuxedo Black ink. I'm stamping it in my stamp positioning tool just so I can stamp that a few times to get a really nice dark impression with that ink. Now this is the sentiment that comes with the stamp set, and I trimmed mine because I wanted a different layout for the words. So I just cut the words and the little B apart. You could also, if you don't want to cut your stamp, and I'm so sorry about my head here, but if you don't want to cut your stamp, you could also just mask off parts of it while you ink it, and then stamp them where you want them to be. I don't mind cutting them apart because they always go right back together if you want to use them in the original intended arrangement. So I stamped my sentiment, and then I also added the little bee coming over here from the side. You can see I've laid out those heart charms up at the top, just so I knew where they were when I was stamping the girl. So I'm going to just go ahead here and speed through the coloring. I'm just coloring this with Copic markers, doing very basic coloring. This image is so detailed and cute on its own. You really do not have to do a lot of difficult or shading that you really have to think about. Just pick colors that you like and add them on. I typically add my darkest shade first and then blend it out with the lighter colors, as you can see I'm doing here on her shirt. And I'll just go ahead and turn on a little music here, and I will be back once she is colored. All right, once I was finished coloring her in, I decided to add just a touch of very light inking down here at the bottom, just to ground this image a little bit more. So you aren't seeing the whole scene beneath her, but you get the hint that there's some grass and she's outside. Just by adding a little bit of this a fern green ink at the bottom using an ink blending tool and a foam pad. Now I followed the same process using another of our stamps. This one is To My Heart, and I just stamped her at the bottom, colored her in, and then I'm adding the heart charms up here at the top. So with the Fairy Love, the little bee girl, I did the same thing. Picked out my charms. I had a dimensional adhesive on the back of those and just kind of laid them out roughly where I wanted them to be, knowing they might pop up a little bit when I add the string here. And that is kind of handy, is that you can just kind of pick them up, add your twine, and have a little wiggle room. The smaller ones always seem to pull up a little bit. There's just not enough surface area on the adhesive to keep them down while you're fiddling with them. But I went ahead and threaded that through all of those, and then I'm going to tape that onto the back. Sort of get them exactly where I want them to be. And I think this is such a nice touch. Any of your cute little character or critter images you can add using this layout. You can stamp them down at the bottom and then add the heart charms up at the top. And I just embellished one of those hearts with a pre-tied bow with that same twine, which I just glued on right at the top. So here's a look at those heart charms on the Be Mine card. And then also on the second card, the With Love card. And I hope you enjoyed today's video featuring our Heart Charms die on 4 different cards. If you did, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also connect with Penny Black on Facebook, Pinterest, Instagram, Twitter, as well as our website and blog. And I will link for all of those for you down in the YouTube description box below. And here's another look at the supplies used in creating these cards.